Good morning and welcome to the Washington Foreign Press Center briefing. My name is Zina Wolfington and I'm the moderator today. It is my pleasure to welcome our distinguished briefer today, Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, James O'Brien. Assistant Secretary O'Brien will discuss the upcoming NATO summit in July, celebrating NATO's 75-year history and its crucial role in ensuring security. This briefing is on the record. It is being live streamed. After we hear from the Assistant Secretary, we will begin the question and answer session, and this briefing will end no later than 10 o'clock. The FPC will post the transcript of this briefing and the video afterwards on our website, which is fpc.state.gov. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to the Assistant Secretary, Jim O'Brien.
Thanks. And thank you all for being here this morning. I'll offer a few framing remarks and then we can have questions and some answers. So we're looking forward to hosting the NATO summit in about 2 weeks. NATO is the largest, most formidable military alliance in history, and to see it reflected here in Washington will, I think, be a reminder of the commitment of allies to build on our collective defense and ensure that all territory covered by the alliance remains well defended in the hope that we will deter any attack and disable any attack should it come. So that's the goal. In attendance, we expect to have leaders from all of the 32 NATO allies, along with representatives of all of NATO's partners in different events. And I'll talk about 3 themes that the summit will focus on. One of them is the health of the alliance itself. As I mentioned, NATO comes to this summit larger and more well-resourced than ever in its history. With the addition of the considerable capacities of Sweden and Finland, NATO is at 32 member states today. We have also seen a great rise, the largest increase in military spending in the alliance's history since 2021, particularly since Russia's unprovoked further invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So with those increases, the NATO Secretary General has announced that 23 of the members, so that's nearly 75%, will be at the 2% commitment made 10 years ago in Wales. Just 5 years ago, the number was 9. So this is a considerable collective accomplishment by the allies saying that we want to work together and we want to work as part of the alliance in effectively defending our territory. In addition, the leaders will have the opportunity to ensure that the money's being spent well. So we will continue the process of refining the collective defense plans. This began last year in Vilnius, had been talked about for some time, but the review of the collective defense plans, the regional defense plans, will continue in this summit so that we know we're not just spending more, but we're spending it on NATO's purpose, which is the collective defense of the territory covered by the alliance. So that's the health of the alliance, and we can discuss some other elements of that in the questions. A second theme and a focus of the summit will be on partnership with the Indo-Pacific. And we expect to have leaders from several of our Indo-Pacific partners participating in the events of the summit and a focus on this. We are doing this because the security concerns faced in the Indo-Pacific are very similar to those that are faced in NATO's Article 5 territory. And so it makes sense to share lessons and to work together against similar collective threats. Both Japan and Korea in particular have been very good partners in addressing the threat posed by Russia. And so we anticipate the opportunity to share views on those subjects, but also to build up the habit of cooperation and the practical areas of collaboration between NATO and our Indo-Pacific partners. The third area of focus will be on ensuring Ukraine's success. And this is a subject I'm sure we'll spend a fair bit of time on. But what we anticipate is that the alliance will agree on a bridge to membership for Ukraine into NATO. What this means is that Ukraine will continue making the reforms that it needs to make and that it is committed to make as part of its annual plan with NATO, as well as with other agreements, and that in that context we see its movement toward the alliance as is irreversible, effectively. So with reforms, we see Ukraine moving forward. What we expect to have is a bridge that, as Secretary Blinken has said, a bridge that is well lit, short, straight, unimpeded, and that we see Ukraine moving forward toward the alliance. Of course, Ukraine's involved in a hot war right now, so we'll discuss that as well. We would like to see Ukraine succeed in this war. Secretary Blinken laid out what that means in his speech in Kyiv several weeks ago. So just to remind you the items we anticipate and what we see ourselves doing, what we believe is that Ukraine needs to demonstrate to Russia that it can continue this fight as long as Russia chooses to continue its unprovoked invasion. And for that to happen, I think a few things that we see on the battlefield have to occur. One is to hold the battleground in the east. Russia, despite tens of thousands of losses of life in the east, has taken very little territory over the last 8 or 9 months. And we see it now being held and even pushed back in the east. At the same time, Ukraine is able to destabilize Russia's firing positions. During the long period before the US assistance arrived, Russia had gotten used to firing from uncomfortably close ranges at Ukrainian targets. And now we see that those firing positions are much less stable, and Russia is being forced to move back, which makes it tactically much less successful. Russia continues a campaign of terrorism against Ukrainian targets, hitting a school yesterday, and an office building on Saturday. That kind of indiscriminate targeting is not going to win the war for Russia, but is an explanation of why Ukraine needs to continue fighting it. It's also why we welcome the contributions of several of our allies in providing additional air defense to Ukraine. This will enable Ukraine to maintain its energy and its economy going forward. And so here we welcome the announcement last week by Romania, the additional announcements from Germany and the Netherlands, as well as the US, France, and Italy of additional interceptors and systems to provide air defense in Ukraine. With that, Ukraine can focus on thriving while this war goes on. And we've seen what that looks like. We saw over this past winter that despite Russia's efforts, Ukraine was able to increase its exports from its southern seaports to almost pre-war levels from Odessa. With that, economic life returned to many of Ukraine's key economic centers in the east. And so we saw production in the steel and metals industries go from single digits up to less than half, but to considerably higher levels than had been before. With effective air defense and with access to export markets, Ukraine can thrive even while Russia continues this fight. Now, what does that mean? And what's happened since Secretary Blinken's speech to suggest that we're on the right trajectory? Well, one thing is that Ukraine is on a path to receive an invitation from the European Union for membership. That will require additional reforms by Ukraine, but will begin the process of integration that began on the Maidan more than 10 years ago. And for that to be an accomplishment of the Ukrainian people is something we shouldn't miss. Now, on top of it, we will have the decision at the NATO summit, as I said, to offer a bridge for Ukraine. And we've also seen the G7 agree to create the resources needed for Ukraine to continue this fight. And this was the decision, which hopefully will be confirmed soon, to use proceeds from immobilized Russian sovereign assets to create a loan vehicle that will provide Ukraine with $50 to $60 billion. And with that, they should be in a position to continue this fight into 2025. So time is on Ukraine's side, not on Russia's side, and we see the dynamics of the battlefield shifting in a meaningful way in recent weeks. And that will be another focus of the NATO summit. In addition, as I mentioned, all of NATO's partners will be there. That's another 30 plus states, and there will be events that highlight the contributions that these partners make to peace and security alongside NATO forces and outside NATO's area of operation. So this will be truly a discussion about the threats to peace and security posed not only by Russia today in Europe, but about other threats that NATO and its partners have to address. With that, why don't I pause for a moment and see what questions we've got.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary O'Brien, for your remarks. Now I would like to open this program up for questions. In the interest of time, we will be taking several questions at a time, and first from journalists in the briefing room, and then a few from those on Zoom. If I call on you, please give your name and your outlet. And the first will go to Yaroslav and Alex. Yaroslav, you.
Without microphone, right?
Without.
Okay, thank you so much. So you've just said about
Can you still introduce yourself?
Yaroslav Dolgopol, Ukrinform News Agency. You've just said Ukraine will be a major focus of the upcoming NATO summit in Washington, D.C. There should be also a NATO-Ukraine Council at the leaders level.
Yes.
You said about offering a bridge to NATO for Ukraine, but what specific deliverables also can we expect at this summit in the Ukrainian context? And secondly, if I may, at the G7 summit in Italy earlier this month, President Biden said that at least 5 countries confirmed their commitment to Patriot batteries and other air defense systems for Ukraine. Should we expect this issue to be one of the topics of discussions and announcements at the Washington summit?
And we'll take a question from Alex as well.
Thanks so much. It's hard to follow Yaroslav's questions, but Alex Rafolo from News Agency Tehran. A couple of questions. You said that we are going to make sure that Russia will be forced to move back when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, and not to continue its air attacks on Ukraine. Can you please either confirm or kill alive the reports that the U.S. permission to use American weapons, inside Russia, is limited with 100 kilometers, which actually puts Russian air bases out of the firing range? Why would the U.S. limit that? Second question on the South Caucasus. Please, when it comes to Georgia, in light of congressional calls to review military relationship with Georgia under the current Georgian Dream regime, which is backed by Russia, are you expecting anything on Georgia during the summit? Any invite? And if not, what message is sending to Georgian people? Thanks so much.
So on Ukraine, as I said, essentially the last several weeks have been a parade of deliverables for Ukraine. And I think what we'll see is at the end of the NATO summit, and then followed by the European political community meeting the next week in the UK, it'll be an opportunity to note that Ukraine is integrating fully into the Western structures that its government and its people have said they want. So we'll have what I expect will be a positive decision from the European Union, making clear the path into membership in the EU. We'll have a clear bridge laid out for Ukraine to join NATO. That includes a number of commitments for reforms by Ukraine, as well as for continued engagement from the West. It will include language about making sure that Ukraine can sustain both the fight and the commitment to reforms. So that's a clear deliverable. We also, I think, are coming together around what success for Ukraine looks like, and that is to hold Russia in the east and potentially drive them back over time, but to destabilize Russia's firing positions, keep the economy and the south open, which will mean a number of pledges around issues of air defense, which President Biden and Secretary Blinken have already foreshadowed, and continued work on keeping the sea routes open and restoring Ukraine's ability to provide power to its people in the fall. All of these things are going to be working together as a package that will allow Ukraine to thrive, even if Russia continues to maintain this unjustified invasion. And then to the questions, Alex, on why limit, I think Jake Sullivan's explained this. We see that the immediate need for Ukraine is to attack the targets that are jeopardizing Ukraine's ability to sustain the fight. And we think that's within the range that has been provided. Other than that, I can't add to what Jake has had to say about the theory behind it. I do think that this strategy, which is very openly announced and described, does put the lie to any claims out of Moscow that the US is looking to escalate this war. We're trying to respond to immediate security threats to the Ukrainian people in the way that we feel is best. Now to Georgia, yes, Georgia and all partners will be invited to participate in the partnership events. We are very troubled by the decisions and the rhetoric coming from a very small number of leaders of the Georgian dream. It's clear 80 to 85% of the Georgian people want further integration to the EU and NATO. The government, and we've seen the Prime Minister recently say that they anticipate their recent actions would not jeopardize that path. We have tried to be very clear, and I think the High Representative Josep Borrell has been very clear today, that these recent actions, the violence against opposition figures, the violence against civil society, the Moscow-based foreign agent law, the apparent decision to award a new port to a Chinese company, all of these things are incompatible with wanting to join the US and EU-based international organizations. So we're asking the government to reconsider its positions, and we've noted that we'll continue reviewing our bilateral or multilateral engagements with the government. It's really pretty simple since we're in the period of the Euro football championships. Georgia has said it wants to come and play in our football league. And then it has said, oh, but by the way, we want to have 15 players on our side of the field. And we said, no, you get the same number of players everybody else has, and you do these things that you want, you do them in the way everyone else does. That's the rules of the club. So it's not really a decision about Georgia's sovereignty. Georgia, in its sovereign right, has decided to join the club, and we're just making clear what that means. So we'll continue those discussions with the Georgian officials in the meantime. Our embassy is very active in communicating with them. A number of European leaders have been very active, and we'll continue those conversations as well, even as we head into the partnership events at the NATO summit. No, they are invited to the partnership events. All NATO partners are invited to the partnership events.
Next, we'll go to Oscar and Augustinus.
Oskar Gurzyński, Polish Press Agency. So in your remarks, you described the Ukraine's path to NATO as irreversible. Is that the word that is going to figure in the the summit language? Because there are reports that the U.S. is opposed to adding that word. You also described the Russian bombardment campaign as terrorist. And last week, senators from both parties introduced a bill making the state designate Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. Do you still maintain opposition to this policy, and why?
Shall we take another one? Augustinus.
Augustinas Šanalis from Lithuanian Public Broadcaster. My question is connected to Oscar's first question. Why a bridge? Why not an invitation? And is U.S. administration against such an invitation for Ukraine to join NATO?
So I can merge those two. I mean, our position's been very clear. As the president has said, Ukraine needs to undertake some reforms so that it's ready to be part of NATO. And now the president's also said, we believe Ukraine can and will accomplish those reforms. And in that context, we see the bridge as short, unimpeded. The path is open for Ukraine to move forward. As far as what language ends up in a particular document or not, I'm not going to try to predict that. But we see it as able to move forward and committed. Secretary Bass was just in Ukraine on Friday. I think he'll be talking to a different group of journalists about that. And what he heard from the Prime Minister and others was a full commitment to the kinds of reforms that we believe Ukraine needs to undertake. But every one of the other 32 members of NATO has had to go through some kind of reform process. And over the last years, with the continued enlargement after the end of the Cold War, those reforms have preceded the entry into NATO. So that's the process we see in this case. We have every confidence that Ukraine can and will achieve that. On the bombardment, Russia is, the answer over the weekend was that they intended to strike a hospital, but accidentally struck an office building. And that's not reassuring when it comes to Russia's commitment to upholding the laws of war. So in that context, you just want to make clear, there's one country that caused this war, Russia, one country that has in its ability the tools to end this war, and that's Russia, and one country that is setting the pace with violations of the laws of war, whether through this now apparently well-aimed but indiscriminate and disproportionate bombardment of civilian targets, or with the theft of children and the kind of atrocities that we saw in the occupied areas early in the war. That's, again, Russia. Now, in that context, there are tools that are appropriate and tools that are inappropriate. I've laid out a comprehensive approach to dealing with to supporting Ukraine so that Ukraine will succeed. We, in addition, have a very strong set of sanctions. We believe those have cost Russia hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. So as a piece of the answer to this war, sanctions are a very important part. The immobilization of Russia's sovereign assets by itself has denied Russia access to $300 billion of revenue that it might otherwise spend on this war. And in that context, being able to use the proceeds for those assets for Ukraine is the kind of flexibility that's necessary. Just the way that the designation rules work, so designating a state as a state sponsor of terror, it changes the flexibility we have to use these resources in support of Ukraine. And that's been a concern for us each time this idea has come up. That's a tool that was written for a different set of issues than for the kind of situation that we're facing right now. So we've been very clear that we want the flexibility to use these resources as the G7 decided to do so just last week, which is to use the proceeds from those resources to help Ukraine in its urgent needs right now. And the state sponsor of terror framework is a very different framework with different uses assigned. And just one last point on the comprehensive approach. We've been open that the reason Russia is able to stay on the battlefield is that it receives considerable support from China. More than 70% of the machine tools that Russia uses to make its weaponry come from China. More than 90% of the electronics that show up on the battlefield come from China. And we've been asking the Chinese officials if they can see their way clear to using the leverage that provides them to bring Russia to negotiations much more quickly. And thus far, they've been unwilling to do that. They did not participate in the peace conference last week, but we'll continue to discuss this issue because it's clear that Russia fights only because China is able to help it. And that plus the closer and closer cooperation Russia shows with Iran and North Korea, two states that Russia has repeatedly agreed to sanction in other contexts, it demonstrates, I think, how thin the level of support Russia has is. And that's where the kind of comprehensive support package with the EU, NATO, more than 50 countries in coalition supporting Ukraine demonstrates the depth of commitment to the policy that we're advancing.
We have time for about 2 more questions. I'll go to Liepa and Kushbo. Liepa, go first.
Okay, thank you. Liepa Jaromskaite, Lithuanian IQ magazine. I wanted some clarification on NATO's strategy towards Ukraine's success, because if at the moment the strategy is to keep Russia in the east, how is that going to help avoid the frozen conflict that Ukraine has been fighting since 2014? And Russia is, I believe, would actually hold it accounted as a victory for itself. Thank you.
Hi, Khushbu from the South China Morning Post. You just mentioned that Russia has been able to continue with its war in Ukraine because of China's help. Will there be, when can we expect a collective action being discussed by NATO allies and partners against China for all the help that it is giving to Russia in Ukraine? My second question is that you talked about a collective defense plan. Will that also include Indo-Pacific, since some of the Indo-Pacific partners are also participating? And then you said that there are several Indo-Pacific partners are coming. Can you name anyone other than the IP4 that's participating this year? Thank you.
So I think the list of all NATO partners is publicly available, and they'll all be invited. So that includes a number of South Asian and other Asian countries. So I'll leave that to your considerable research skills. And thanks for the first question on the danger of a frozen conflict. This is a source of concern. And let me clarify. When I talk about the strategy for Ukraine to thrive now, I'm talking about right now. And that's, you have to stop the sort of Russian attempt to nibble their way forward in the east. And that's the first step of success. Once Russia finds that it can't use its close-in firing positions, that it can't stop Ukraine from restarting its economy, that with enough air defense and enough support from the West, Ukraine can continue this fight for a considerable period. Then we come to the point where Russia has to think, can we go forward with the very limited support internationally that we're receiving against this much larger coalition of countries? And really, we've said clearly our definition of success is that Ukraine is ultimately able to govern all of its internationally recognized territory. The question of step by step how one gets there, I'm very focused on right now, seeing a change in the battlefield from the narratives that were common, I'd say, a month or two ago, and that's the focus. So thanks for letting me clarify on that piece. The other question with the regional defense plans. So these are defense plans of Article 5 territory. That's specifically the element I was discussing. In the Indo-Pacific, we'll talk about lessons and ways that we might continue to work together, but I don't want to indicate any specific action. Collectively, with regard to China, I mean, the US and now we anticipate the EU have taken steps against Chinese companies that are part of circumventing the global sanctions against Russia. This began 2 years ago with the imposition of the oil price cap that we want to see the Chinese purchasers of Russian oil comply with that or be subject to sanctions. And now we're seeing the same with some of the providers of goods into the Russian defense establishment. So there is already a strong international statement that what China's doing is incompatible with trying to resolve this conflict. And what we're asking is that China use its leverage to bring Russia back to a negotiating table to resolve this conflict in accordance with the UN Charter.
I have one more question, Rusudan. Go ahead. Yep.
Organizing this very important event. If I may follow up on Georgia.
Introduce yourself.
Rusudan Shaliev from Georgia, Global News, Georgia. When you mentioned that despite what the Georgian government has done in the past couple of months, at least, you are actively working and communicating with them. May I ask what the main topics of these discussions are? And also, are you considering further actions in terms of consequences, such as more road sanctions, to hold accountable all those individuals who are responsible for the processes, what we have seen in Georgia for last year.
So we talk about the full range of topics that are related to our bilateral relationship. Secretary Blinken has said we are reviewing every part of our bilateral relationship, and so we talk to our Georgian counterparts about that. We want them to understand that the path they are on and the rhetoric they are using about the West is incompatible with what 80% of Georgia's citizens say that they want. And we want the voters of Georgia to understand that, and we want the politicians making a decision to be clear that if they continue this path, they are jeopardizing what they told us last year they very much wanted, which was closer integration and a path toward the EU and closer cooperation with NATO. So we're trying to be as clear as we can that there is a way to step back from the path that they have chosen. We don't preview actions that we take with regard to individuals and institutions. Again, Secretary Blinken announced several weeks ago a policy that anyone who's undermining the path to democracy in Georgia would face some kind of repercussion. And if we decide that that's an appropriate thing to do, then we'll announce those at the time that we have the decision.
Thank you. And this
Thank
ends
you all very much.
Q&A session, and thank you to Assistant Secretary O'Brien and to all FPC members who joined us today. This concludes today's briefing.